I'm joined today by Sam Delaney. Sam, sir, how are you?
Very good, thanks.
Enjoying finding some nice weather out there.
Absolutely, really nice.
Good stuff. Let me delve straight in. You've been very open about your mental health struggles and things that have gone on in your life. Was that a moment of realization you needed to be you wanted to speak freely, or did it come because of something happened?
Well, first of all, what happened was when I was in my late 30s, so just over 10 years ago, I really let things get on top of me and I started basically drinking to cope because I had no other ideas about how to cope. I realise that now, I didn't realise at the time.
Yeah.
And that sort of forced me to what a lot of people in addiction recovery call the luxury of desperation. In as much as I had never understood anything about my mental health, never gone in for much self-reflection. I think that's very common in men of my generation. Everything was a bit of a joke to us. You know, we kind of grew up in the 90s. You were sort of encouraged to not take anything seriously, most of all yourself. So I was very hostile to the idea of ever kind of reflecting on my own feelings. But I think that because I could see that the drinking was really out of hand and it was affecting all the different important aspects of my life, that forced me to confront coping with that. And as a result of going to get help for that, naturally, first you stop drinking, which is almost the easy bit. The next bit is you start having to look at what the reasons were that you were drinking. That led me down a path of, sort of investigating my own mental health and my own emotional health a little bit more deeply than I'd ever done before. And, as soon as something starts to work, you carry on doing it, right? It was a revelation to me. At first, I was pretty private about it, as you tend to be, because you've had like a problem and there's feelings of shame and stuff like that. But gradually, after a couple of years, I started to open up somewhat. Firstly, in press, I wrote an article in The Guardian back in about 2018, in which it wasn't really about me, it was about men's mental health.
Yeah.
And the editor asked me to put just a little bit of my own experiences in. And in a sort of a 3,000 word article, I wrote about no more than 300 words about my own experience at their behest.
Right. Were you reluctant to that?
I was somewhat. I submitted the piece. It was actually about a men's mental health group, which is a fantastic thing called Andy's Man Club. That was what the piece was about. And I'd kind of written all about those people. And the editor took the first draft and said, "We like this, but it would really benefit from some first person stuff." So I said,
Were they aware?
No, they weren't aware of what I had been through.
Okay.
They knew that I was interested in men's mental health because I had told them, and that's why I pitched this article to them. But they didn't know anything about my own personal experiences, and they really encouraged me in a nice way, not in a pushy way. So I wrote a sort of fairly guarded, I felt, couple of paragraphs about I struggled with drink. Yeah. So I went to this group, and then I found help elsewhere, and this is how it's helped me. And the response I got, and I'd been writing for a living in the national press for 20 years, and I'd never had such a big response in terms of people getting in touch with me via email and social media, and even friends and family getting in touch and saying, "Oh, I never knew what you'd been through, but well done." When I wrote it, I was worried about being judged in all manner of different ways. There was feelings of shame.
Yeah.
A lot of it came from a place of people will think, look at this guy. He's got a good life. He's got a wife and family. He's got a good career. He's a privileged kind of middle class guy.
Yeah.
And that phrase kept coming back to me like first world problems. That's what everyone's going to say, right? Because we live in a cynical world, and that's what my head was full of. The reality was the opposite. So many people got in touch. And one of the things, and it was, I would say, 100% positive. And one of the things that kept coming up was because of my persona, which was a bit of Jack the Lad, right? Both to friends and family, but also in the wider world. I've been hosting on Talk Sport, which is a very blokey sort of station for years. And my journalism was often kind of knockabout and funny and kind of a tone of who cares sort of thing. People thought that it was particularly striking and powerful that someone with my persona had been willing to display vulnerability. And the big thing in that was other blokes like me, perhaps guys. I mean, I'd grown up as a working class guy when I was in a working class environment when I was a kid, and all of my cultural influences were, you know, basically being in the pub, acting the fool, going to football matches and all the rest of it. And a lot of blokes in that culture find it particularly difficult to open up because they feel that they'll be judged.
Yeah.
And so many guys got in touch with me, God, I thought it was just me. Yeah. And that was the crucial. When I realised people were saying, I thought it was just me, but now you've opened up.
Yeah.
I realised that it's not just me. So straight away what that does is it takes away feelings of shame somewhat. And I knew this because I'd had a couple of people in my own life who'd been like that, including one older brother who'd also quit drink about 8 years before me.
Okay.
And was a big influence on me. He's 8 years older than me.
Yeah.
And he'd been sort of like as much a father figure as a brother growing up. And so his willingness and ability to, you know, get his head straight and be vulnerable had a big influence on me. A couple of other blokes as well. So I knew the power that had. And then when I saw I could have that power too, I thought, right, well, first of all, I haven't been judged in the way that I thought I might be.
Yeah.
Second of all, there are people who this is really helping. So after that, I thought, well, I'll write a bit more. And then I'll start speaking about it as well. And the more I did it, the more positive feedback came. Now, there's two things here. One is I want to help people, of course, because that's what I needed. And that could have saved my life because I was in a really bad stage 10, 11 years ago. Yeah. And, you know, other people helping me and showing me the way and being vulnerable and showing me that I wasn't alone. That was by a mile the most powerful thing in helping me become a better person. But obviously I have an ego like anyone else. And like, you know, part of it's like, oh, people like this and I'm getting some positive. So, you're helping people. You are helping yourself. Yeah. Right. You are helping yourself because me personally, when I share, I find it very cathartic.
Yes.
I'm not one of these people who says all men should share, all men should open up. I think that that's a little bit unfair because not all men can. Yeah. Not all men want to, and not all men necessarily have the tools to. You know, I've been a broadcaster and writer my whole life. I have a certain ability to speak, about these things and express my feelings. And the more I've done it, the better I've come at it.
Yeah.
But not everyone can do it. And I think there's a lot of people like you. It's like victim blaming. We hear a lot of messages. It's like men need to open up about their feelings. Yeah. Men need to learn how to talk about this like women do. Well, maybe they can't. Maybe they don't want to. Yeah. You don't have to. But if you can and you're willing to, and I realised I was, and it's not done me harm to do it, and it helps me in my own mental health. It helps other people around me. It helps even people I don't know. It's it's a great thing to do because it makes people feel less isolated, less alone, less ashamed. And once you withdraw those things, people can really start to make a difference.
Yeah, so let me ask you two questions. I mean, there's many questions I want to ask about, but let me take you back. Firstly, if it hadn't been for your editor pushing you to make it more personal, would you have got there? Do you feel you would have got there anyway? And do you then, like, how do you look back on them doing that to you?
I think that was a key moment, actually, pitching that piece about mental health. I think part of me wanted, after 2 years of sobriety, it was about 2, almost 3 years, I felt that I was kind of, sort of part of me was saying, you should start telling your story, it will help people. But I was nervous. Yeah. And so I pitched them a piece about Andy's Man Club. Okay. But I did not pitch it in terms of, I'll make this about me. Yeah. It was more like, I am interested in men and mental health, and I think this is an interesting story. And so I think I was sort of sending out cautious signs that I was almost ready, but I did need that push. And the editor at Guardian magazine gave me the push I needed. I think maybe I would have got there in time, but, you know, we're talking about 2018. That's 7 years ago. The difference just in those 7 years in the wider culture here in the UK amongst men is pretty extreme.
So that was my next follow-up question. Okay, so where are we now? How do you view it?
So now it's much easier, I think. Obviously it's easier for me. I've been doing it for 7 years. I've done a couple of books. I've got a podcast, and this is what I do now. I spend a lot of my time doing this stuff. But I think if you were starting out today doing it, it would be somewhat easier as well, because I think, you know, incrementally, so many different people have started to speak out and speak up that suddenly it's become much more normalized. And the sort of people that I have on my podcast, for instance, are, when I started out a podcast about mental health, I wanted to interview the sort of people that you would not ordinarily think would speak about these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So, these were like, there was famous people, like there was, pop stars or footballers. But then there was, like there's guys who are like reformed football hooligans or boxers or soldiers, guys who you would associate with a sort of a traditional form of like kind of, hard man or masculinity, old fashioned masculinity, who will come on the podcast and cry or talk about how important it is to share feelings. And when I started 7-8 years ago, I don't think there was as many guys willing to do that. Now there is. I'm not saying I'm not saying that that's because of what I've been doing. I just think society's been moving in a good direction. And I think the thing is, it's about as many different voices out there telling their own story. Because what I found was, when you read deeply into, not to sound pretentious, but how to cope with the human condition, how to cope with being a human who has irrational feelings, worries about the future, anxiety, regret, all these things that ultimately we all deal with at some point in our lives. Sometimes when we wake up in the middle of the night and we start worrying about whatever. Life can be tough. We all face challenges. You can look back through ancient philosophy, religion, psychotherapy, and everything else. The messages you get about this stuff are largely the same. You won't find any kind of profound new take on how to deal with it, whether you read Plato or you listen to the Fern Cotton podcast. The key thing is, and it all works, right? About how to deal with being human. The key to it is as many different people saying it in as many different ways as possible. So we all have a chance of finding someone we relate to. Yeah. So when I was first going through it, I felt that a lot of the stories being told, or a lot of these conversations, were firstly, the language was quite feminized, right? Which was great because women were so far ahead of us, generally speaking, ahead of men in being able to be vulnerable and speak about their emotions. But it was harder for me to sort of tap in and relate to those sorts of stories because there weren't as many kind of experiences, life experiences, or the sort of language that I could relate to. There was some sort of stuff that I found kind of quite hippie-ish, right? And spiritual, which I was hostile to at that time. Yeah. I'm less hostile to all this stuff now, by the way. I get involved in any sort of weird conversation.
No, like, bring it on.
But back then, I was like hostile to that. And then there were some men talking about it, but I found it quite sort of woo-woo, quite middle class, and a little bit kind of off-putting. I thought, these aren't my guys. They don't understand the sort of life I've had. They haven't been through things I've been through. How could they possibly understand me? And, and so what I found was, if I did find blokes who I sort of thought, well, they've got the same sense of humour as me. Yeah. They talk the way I do. They seem to have had a similar sort of life, similar amount of kind of cultural tastes or influences. It just makes it easier to when you see someone who's like you talking about these things, it makes it easier to tap into it. So that's what I try to do for other blokes like me. But it's not just about blokes like me, although it is a particular crisis amongst kind of middle-aged guys in this country. But all human beings have challenges they need to face. So as many different types of people, across the whole range of it, whether it's, gender or racial or class or anything like that, we all share, if there's people sharing their stories, then that means someone somewhere is going to find you and your voice and think, yes, that's the person I can relate to. Finally, this has clicked. Now I want to engage in these conversations about mental health and about positive ways to cope with life and pain and challenges.
So I think I think at this point, we now live in a world with like Andrew Tate and adolescence and the manosphere, or whatever we want to call it. Give us your feelings towards it. Has the responsibility of what you're doing now moved on to actually not just being about the middle-aged kind of, and actually you're looking at the teenagers and kind of the younger people, younger males, and how they're coping in the world as well.
Yeah, I think identity is a huge factor in all of our mental health. Like, who do we want to be? How do we see ourselves? And what's the gap between who you feel you should be and what you actually are, right? I think that gap is sometimes like the source of our pain. So you look at young men growing up, and they're struggling for identity, right? They don't know who they are, and so role models come out, people who are clever, manipulative, can appeal to people's worst, appeal to young people's vulnerabilities. This is Andrew Tate and a whole legion of other kind of online influences who sort of imitate him, right? They give a sort of convincing idea of male identity that you should aspire to that is ultimately quite toxic, right? Because it involves a lot of intolerance towards women or homosexuals or all sorts of people, really. And but I can see why vulnerable young men who are struggling. I've got a 13-year-old son myself, and that's a really tough age. And you're struggling. You think, who am I? Do I have any respect? Am I popular? Am I liked? Am I going to be successful? And all the rest of it. And someone comes along with a bunch of simple answers, and I can see why that can be appealing. It's really important to fight against it for various reasons. When you look at our ability to cope, to manage our mental health in a positive way, a lot of that is about kind of being kind to ourselves, right? And appreciating the beauty and joy of life where you can. If you look at these kind of influences in the manosphere, whether that's Tate or anyone else, the themes you will see is not really being kind to yourself, punishing yourself constantly, living some sort of like extreme monk-like existence, which is fairly joyless, very austere, focused entirely on constant productivity and self-progression, rooted in a lot of kind of judgment and hate of yourself and other people. These are the ideas that are the antithesis of looking after one's mental health in a positive way, right? What I think is important is enjoying life when you can, connecting with other human beings, giving love, receiving love, and having fun. And the key thing about when you see these blokes in the manosphere is they are extremely boring, right? Extremely boring. The currency for my generation is not perfect, but the currency for my generation of blokes who kind of age in the 90s was having a laugh, making each other laugh. That was a form of connection. And whilst that did go too far at times because we weren't taking anything at all seriously, it remains a beautiful way of connecting with other people. Life's there to be enjoyed, right? I want to hang out with guys who are amusing, generous, kind, but are going to be fun and not take themselves too seriously, right? If you watch any Andrew Tate video, especially the ones where occasionally he's sitting around with his mates, all of whom, by the way, are almost always topless, weird, right? And they'll be sitting around, I saw this clip where they're all sitting around a table and they're eating kind of semi-raw meats and smoking cigars, and they're deadly serious, right? Because they're trying to live this contrived idea of the man in the 21st century being some kind of like warrior, right? You're not a warrior. You're a really weird guy with a YouTube channel, kind of manipulating adolescent nerds around the world, right? You're really tedious. You're obsessed with actually a quite conventional approach to life, which is sort of dictated by rules, regulation, consistency, routine. What happened to us aspiring to blokes who are funny, maverick, a little bit rebellious, do their own thing? These are the kind of things that I try to instill in my son. I want him to have fun. I want him to be funny. I want him to be generous, kind, and just be a bit of a laugh. So his thing on Andrew Tate is, why does anyone like him? It's really boring. It's dull. And it sounds like a lot of hassle. And he seems like a weirdo. So that's my sort of take, is like, you've got to reframe these guys for young men as, these are weirdos. These are like, when I was a kid at school, you'll remember this, I'm sure. There was kids who left in the 5th year having done their GCSEs, and the next year they'd always come back and hang around the gates. Right? But by this stage they'd have a car, and they'd be smoking fags, and they'd think they're cool, and they'd always, and most of us would think, God, these are losers. Like, they haven't moved on. They still want to hang around, but they'd like, I'm driving my mum's hatchback. I've got a job. in WH Smith's and I'm smoking fags and the teachers can't tell me what to do anymore, right? And you'd all think, weirdos. But there would always be a few kids, younger kids, who would be sucked into their sphere of influence. And they were usually kids who were struggling somewhat, whether it was socially or romantically or in some other sense. You know, they might be kids who are struggling to fit in. And they would be the ones who were attracted to these weird sort of older kids who are hanging around by school gates. And these older kids would like bullshit them with all their far-fetched tales of pub violence or girls that they'd got off with or all this other stuff. And I look at Andrew Tate and these other people going, they're those guys. They're these weirdos trying to sort of, they can't really get much kudos in the real world. So they're trying to get it from the most vulnerable young men in society.
So I think,
go on.
So let me ask you that my last kind of, if then, however, kind of in 2018 when your editor pushed you to talk about work, you're a parent of a boy of the age. Do you have this responsibility to talk about it as a parent and your position as a journalist and everything around that? And do you find it frustrating, the fact that kind of cutting through the noise to be able to?
I find it somewhat frustrating, but I also am quite inspired by the opportunity to counterbalance this, because I think you'll read a lot of long-winded pieces in broadsheet newspapers that over-intellectualise the appeal of Andrew Tate and, hand-wringing think pieces about the state of the young men in our society. And I think in a way that overcomplicates it. I mean, I watched Adolescence with my son.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because he really watched it. And, anyone with a teenage son will know, for them to get through and watch anything on TV at length without switching to their phone at some point or wanting to go and play a video game or whatever is rare. But he watched it and he enjoyed it. And I said, what did you think? He said, it was good. I enjoyed it. And I said, do you think it was realistic? And he laughed and went, no. And I said, why not? He said, well, I don't know anyone who's killed anyone. And I said, okay, that's a good point. And then I started doing that thing that we've all got an instinct to do, is go, and do you feel like you lack respect?
Yeah.
And do you feel that you spend too much on your phone? He said, look, Dad, we both know you spend way more time on your phone than I do. Again, I said, fair enough, that's true, right? And he said, it's like, it's an extreme version that happens somewhat.
Yeah.
And I thought, my role is to basically make him sufficiently loved and to spend a sufficient amount of time with him and be his mate and show him alternative ways of being, right? That he's therefore not rendered vulnerable to the toxic influence of other men like Andrew Tate, right? And about remaining sort of it's hard to be a positive role model, but just to be engaged in your son's life, to be engaged with your children and spend time with them and connect with them in not just big, profound ways with big, deep conversations, just have fun with them, which I try to do with my son. We share interests and hobbies, we do things together. That is what prevents you from being vulnerable. I mean, when I was a kid, we didn't have the internet, but I, like a lot of kids in my generation and background, spent a huge amount of time sort of alone with our parents because I was from a broken home. I was raised by a single mother and she worked all the time. So my house was chaotic and I was alone. And my equivalent was I would find myself out on the streets, and so it's all the same as it ever was. Back then, there wasn't Andrew Tate on your laptop, but there was like a bunch of kids who lived on your estate who were dodgy. There were those kids by the school gates, and I think that my mum struggled to spend as much time with me, and I didn't really see my dad, but I was instilled with enough self-respect and a sense that I was loved and cared about, and I had enough going on elsewhere in my life to not feel so desperate to be forced into the arms of people who I knew deep down were a bad influence and were awful people. And I think that's probably how I approach parenting my kids now. And I think that as someone with something of a platform, in the press or in broadcasts who talks about this sort of stuff, to be honest, rather than over-intellectualise it, I think, a lot of blokes should just be reframing, Andrew Tate and his ilk for young people as like, these people are dull, they're boring, they're full of shit, they are not a laugh, and if they came down to the football or to our local boozer or wherever it was, they would be laughed out of the place by people of their own age because they would be quite rightly considered to be like idiots.
Yeah.
And I think, laughing at these people is as effective as anything else.
Sam, I think on that note, that's a beautiful note. Thank you so much for your time today.
Real
Lovely
pleasure.
chatting.